The old German shepherd wouldn't stop digging at the floor of a locked train car. And the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became to know why. Snow whipped through the open railard as Ethan dropped to his knees beside Duke. The dog's front paw was bleeding, but he kept clawing at the same patch of floorboards. A dull, metallic thud echoed from beneath the wood. Ethan pried up one board, then froze. Hidden below was something that should never have been there, and someone else seemed to know it existed. What do you think was hidden inside? The wind came down from the Bitterroot Mountains like a warning. It rolled across the abandoned railyard outside Darby, Montana, carrying the smell of rust, wet pine, and the first promise of winter. Gray clouds hung low over the valley, pressing the world beneath them into dull shades of steel and ash. Ethan Walker stood near the back fence, with both hands buried in the pockets of a faded field jacket. 69 years old, one backpack, one army sleeping bag, $10 and Duke. The German shepherd sat beside him without moving his amber eyes, scanning the yard the way he scanned everything. Calm, alert, patient. The auctioneer's voice echoed across the gravel lot. Next item. A few contractors shuffled forward. Someone laughed. Someone spat tobacco into the dirt. Old excavator parts changed hands. Broken generators. Rusted fuel tanks. Scrap metal. None of it mattered to Ethan. He wasn't there because he needed equipment. He was there because he needed somewhere to exist. 3 nights earlier, he had slept behind a church in Hamilton. The night before that, he had spent under the awning of a closed hardware store. The cold had been getting worse. Montana winters didn't negotiate. They simply arrived. Duke shifted slightly beside him. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck. The shepherd's fur was thicker than it had been during his working years overseas, but the scars were still there. One beneath the jaw, another near the shoulder. Reminders of places neither of them talked about. Not that dogs talked, but some silences were shared. The auction moved toward the far edge of the property, toward a forgotten stretch of disconnected railroad track. Most people barely glanced at it. A single railcar sat there alone. Its wooden sides were dark with age. Its iron wheels were half buried in gravel. Rust crawled over every hinge and bracket, like a disease. The heavy sliding door was secured by an enormous steel lock. The thing looked less like a rail car and more like a tomb. The auctioneer checked his clipboard. Last item of the day. A few people were already walking toward their trucks. The old army transport car that got a few looks. Not many. County records say it's been sitting here since sometime after World War II. Someone chuckled. Nobody's opened it. Nope. What if there's gold inside? That earned louder laughter. The auctioneer grinned. If there is, it'll be yours. More laughter. Then he raised his voice. Minimum bid $10. Silence. The contractors looked away. The scrap dealers shook their heads. Too expensive to move. Too much risk. No obvious value. Just an old locked rail car, rotting beside forgotten tracks. The wind blew harder. Ethan stared at it. For some reason he couldn't explain. The rail car felt familiar. Not the car itself. The feeling. Something abandoned. Something left behind after people decided it wasn't worth keeping. The auctioneer waited. No bidders. Silence again. Then Ethan heard his own voice. $10. Heads turned. Several men looked him up and down. An old homeless veteran, a worn backpack, a military sleeping bag, rolled under one arm, a dog, nothing else. One of the contractors laughed. Well, that's one way to spend your last $10. The others smiled. Ethan ignored them. The auctioneer shrugged. $10 any higher? Nobody answered. The gavel struck. Sold. The sound echoed across the yard. Ethan stepped forward. His fingers counted out the last $10 he possessed, one bill at a time. When the receipt touched his hand, he officially owned the railcar. For a moment, nothing happened. The crowd began dispersing. Engines started. Truck doors slammed. Life moved on. Then Duke stood up, not casually. Immediately, his ears rose. His body stiffened. Every muscle locked into place. Ethan noticed at once the same posture, the same focus. He had seen it years ago, during security sweeps. When Duke found something, the dog wasn't looking at him, wasn't looking at the people, wasn't looking at the trucks. He was staring directly at the locked rail car, unblinking, motionless, as if something on the other side of that rusted door had just called his name. Ethan followed his gaze. The wind howled through the broken pines beyond the fence. The rail car sat alone at the end of the track, waiting. And for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt something besides exhaustion. Curiosity. Duke took a single step toward the rail car, then another, and without making a sound, he walked straight to the locked door and stopped. The old dog lowered his nose to the cold steel. Then, he simply stood there watching, listening, waiting, as if he already knew there was something inside. Something nobody else had noticed for nearly 80 years. And whatever it was about to change both of their lives. But Ethan Walker didn't know that yet. Standing in the fading afternoon light, he simply watched Duke stare at the locked rail car. The old shepherd didn't bark, didn't scratch, didn't growl. He just stood there, focused on something hidden behind 80 years of steel, dust, and silence. "Easy, buddy," Ethan said softly. Duke finally looked back at him. For a moment, the dog seemed almost reluctant to leave. Then he followed Ethan toward the far end of the yard, where a few auction workers were packing up tables. Snowflakes had begun drifting down from the gray Montana sky. Small at first, barely noticeable, the kind that warned of bigger storms coming. The auctioneer handed Ethan a folded receipt. "You really planning to keep that thing?" Ethan glanced toward the rail car. "I guess I am." The man laughed quietly. "Well, congratulations. You're the proud owner of the most useless piece of property in Ravalli County." A few workers chuckled. Ethan forced a smile. He'd heard worse, much worse. By sunset, the yard was empty. Only the rail car remained. And Ethan and Duke. The silence felt enormous. The disconnected stretch of track disappeared into weeds and brush before ending abruptly beneath a stand of pine trees. Beyond that, mountains rose into the clouds, cold, dark, unforgiving. Ethan climbed into the rail car using the rusted side ladder. The lock remained in place. He couldn't get inside. Not yet. But there was a narrow overhang near the door that offered shelter from the wind. For now, that would have to be enough. He unrolled his army sleeping bag beside the rail car and sat down. Duke immediately positioned himself facing the open yard, always watching, always working, even after retirement. Ethan pulled a protein bar from his backpack. His last one. He broke it in half. Duke accepted his piece gently. The dog chewed twice, then dropped half of it back into Ethan's hand. Ethan stared. A laugh escaped him before he could stop it. "You still do that." Duke's tail thumped once against the gravel. The first genuine smile Ethan had worn in days appeared and disappeared just as quickly. Darkness settled over the valley. A freight train horn echoed somewhere far away. The sound rolled through the mountains. Long, lonely, ancient. Ethan froze. For a second, He wasn't in Montana anymore. He was standing outside Baghdad. Night operations, dust in the air, engines rumbling beyond the perimeter. Waiting, always waiting. His hand moved instinctively toward his hip, toward a sidearm that wasn't there, hadn't been there for years. A cold gust snapped him back. Montana, not Iraq, not 2005 now. Here. Duke quietly moved closer and rested against his leg. Solid, warm, real. The tremor in Ethan's hand slowly faded. You remember too, don't you? The shepherd lifted his head. His scarred ears twitched. Neither of them slept much that night. Around midnight, Ethan woke suddenly. No nightmare, just instinct. Something had pulled him awake. The yard sat silent beneath fresh snow. Moonlight reflected off frozen rails. Everything looked silver. Still, except Duke. The dog was standing, facing the rail car again, completely motionless. His nose pointed directly toward the locked door. Ethan sat up. What's wrong? No response, just focus. The same focus Ethan remembered from military working dogs searching compounds overseas. Something had his attention. Something inside. Minutes passed. Then Duke slowly relaxed and returned to Ethan's side. Whatever he'd sensed was gone, or hidden again. The next morning arrived, cold and bright. Frost covered the gravel. Ethan rubbed warmth into his hands and looked toward the rail car. The old steel lock gleamed beneath a layer of ice. For the first time, he noticed faded markings beneath years of rust. Letters barely visible, military markings, old ones. His eyes narrowed. The rail car wasn't just old. It had belonged to the army, and suddenly, the strange feeling he'd carried since yesterday returned. The sense that this wasn't an accident, that somehow this forgotten rail car had been waiting, not for decades, not for history, for someone. Duke stood beside him and stared at the door again, waiting the same way he had at the auction, the same way he had all night. And Ethan realized something unsettling. The dog wasn't interested in the rail car. He was interested in whatever was inside it. The question was why, and neither of them would have to wait much longer to find out. The answer, however, had begun long before the rail car, long before the auction, long before Ethan Walker found himself sleeping beside a forgotten piece of American history. It had started at his ranch, the last place that had ever truly felt like home. 3 months earlier, autumn had still clung to the Bitterroot Valley. The aspens glowed gold against the mountains. The grass remained green, and Ethan still believed his family was his family. The ranch wasn't much. 40 acres, a weathered farmhouse, a machine shed, a few horses he no longer rode. But it had been enough. More importantly, it had been paid for. Ethan sat at the head of the kitchen table one October evening, while Duke slept beneath the window. His son Michael had driven over from Missoula. His daughter Claire had come from Spokane. The visit felt unusual from the moment they arrived. Too coordinated, too careful. People who rarely found time to visit suddenly appeared on the same day. Ethan noticed. Old soldiers noticed things. He noticed where people sat, how often they looked at each other, what they avoided saying. Michael poured coffee. Claire kept checking her phone. Neither looked relaxed. The ice maker in the refrigerator suddenly dumped a load of cubes. The sharp clatter echoed through the kitchen. Ethan's shoulders tightened instantly. For half a second, he wasn't in Montana. Concrete, heat, a military checkpoint, outside Baghdad. Spent brass hitting pavement. Then it was gone. Back to the kitchen. Back to home, Claire noticed. Her eyes softened. Dad, I'm fine. He wasn't, but he was used to saying it. The conversation drifted through safe topics. Weather, gas prices, the ranch. Then Michael finally leaned forward. "Dad, maybe it's time to stop pretending you can do this alone." The room became very quiet. Even Duke lifted his head. Ethan looked at his son. "What does that mean?" Michael exchanged a glance with Claire. The same glance. The kind people share when they've already discussed everything beforehand. Claire sighed. "We worry about you." "I'm still standing, Dad. I'm still standing." No one spoke for several seconds. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods. Inside, something felt wrong, dangerous, not physically, emotionally, like walking into an area that looked safe until you noticed all the birds had stopped singing. A memory surfaced. Iraq. His convoy approaching an abandoned intersection. Everything looked normal. Too normal. That was usually the warning. Michael opened a folder. The moment Ethan saw paperwork, he knew. His stomach sank. Not fear. Recognition. The same feeling a soldier gets before bad news arrives. "We've been talking to an attorney," Michael said. Duke stood up. The shepherd quietly crossed the room and sat beside Ethan's chair. Claire folded her hands. "Dad, you're almost 70, so the ranch is becoming too much." "It isn't. The roof needs repairs. I repaired it. The fences. I repaired those too." Michael slid documents across the table. "We found a buyer." The words landed harder than shouting would have. A buyer. Not a discussion. Not a possibility. A buyer. Ethan stared at the papers. His name, property descriptions, numbers, signatures. Years earlier, after his wife Rachel died from cancer, Michael and Claire had convinced him to place their names on certain ownership documents, just in case. Estate planning, protection, family. He'd trusted them now. He understood. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once. "You already made the decision." Neither answered, which was answer enough. Claire finally looked down. "We think assisted living would be safer." Ethan laughed once, a dry sound. Not humor. Disbelief. "This is my home." Michael rubbed his forehead. "Dad, we're trying to help." "No," the word came quietly. "You aren't." Silence. Then Michael said the sentence Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. "We can't keep carrying this responsibility." The room froze. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. Ethan looked at the wall, at the bronze star mounted beside a photograph of Rachel, at the flag folded inside a display case, at decades of work, sacrifice, service gone, reduced to responsibility, reduced to burden. Duke pressed against his leg. The dog didn't understand the words, but he understood the change in the room, the shift, the wound. Ethan nodded once slowly. Then he stood. Conversation over. No yelling, no threats, no dramatic speeches. Just a tired man walking out onto his porch, while the people he loved sat inside, deciding what would happen to the rest of his life. 3 weeks later, the ranch belonged to someone else. The morning he left, frost covered the pasture. The mountains were hidden behind low clouds. Ethan loaded his backpack, his sleeping bag, a few clothes, nothing more. No one came to help. No one came to stop him. Duke climbed into the truck without being asked. Ethan looked at the house one final time, then at the dog. "You ready, partner?" Duke's tail tapped once against the seat. That was answer enough. The truck rolled down the gravel driveway. Neither of them looked back, and by the end of that week, Ethan Walker would become a homeless veteran. With nowhere to go, except wherever the road decided to take him, the truck lasted 12 more days. 12 days of back roads, gas station, coffee, and sleeping in places nobody noticed. Ethan avoided cities. Old habits. Big crowds meant too many entrances, too many exits, too many variables. The farther he traveled into western Montana, the quieter the world became. Eventually, the fuel gauge reached empty. The truck stopped outside a shuttered feed store near Stevensville. That morning, Ethan sold it for less than it was worth. The buyer counted out cash without much interest in the man standing across from him. By sunset, most of that money was already gone. Food. Dog food. A motel room for one night. One last night, indoors before reality caught up. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed. Duke lay across the doorway. Not beside the bed. Not near the window. The doorway. Guarding. Always guarding. The television flickered silently in the corner. Images moved across the screen. Wars, politics, storms, the usual. Ethan turned it off. The silence felt better. Around 2:00 the morning, a car door slammed outside. His eyes opened instantly. No confusion, no transition. 1 second asleep, the next fully awake. Heart racing, breathing shallow. The room vanished. For a brief moment, he was back in Iraq. A dark operations compound. Incoming reports. Night movement. Waiting for contact. His hand shot toward the nightstand. Toward a weapon that hadn't been there in years. Nothing. Only air. Then reality returned. The motel room, Montana winter. Duke was already beside him. The shepherd pressed his head against Ethan's knee. Not demanding. Not needy. Just there. A silent reminder that the war was over. Eventually, Ethan leaned forward and rested a hand on the dog's neck. Good catch, buddy. Duke closed his eyes. The next morning, they left. The money continued shrinking. A church in Hamilton offered breakfast. Nobody asked questions. An elderly volunteer poured coffee into a paper cup. Another handed Ethan 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. The kindness nearly hurt more than the cold. People who owed him nothing were helping. People who owed him everything had disappeared. Outside, Duke waited patiently beneath a maple tree. The dog accepted 1 sandwich, then pushed half of it back into Ethan's lap again. The same ritual, the same stubborn loyalty. You always were terrible at following orders. Duke's tail moved once. The days blended together after that. A truck stop outside Lolo, a bus shelter. A campground closed for the season. Snow began falling more often. The mountains turned white. The nights became dangerous. One evening, Ethan found an abandoned picnic shelter near a frozen creek. The roof still held barely. He spread the sleeping bag beneath the wooden structure. Duke circled twice before settling beside him. The temperature dropped fast after sunset. The cold crept through layers of fabric, through boots, through bone. Sometime after midnight, Ethan woke again. This time, it wasn't a nightmare. It was Duke. The shepherd was standing, rigid, ears forward, watching the darkness beyond the trees. Ethan sat up immediately. Every trace of sleep vanished. The dog never wasted energy on false alarms. Ethan listened. Nothing. Just wine moving through pine branches. Then he heard it. Footsteps slow crunching through snow. Someone was out there. Maybe another drifter. Maybe a hunter. Maybe nobody dangerous at all. But Ethan's body had already shifted into an old familiar mode. Observe. Assess. Wait. The footsteps stopped. A long minute passed. Then another. Eventually, whoever it was moved away. The sound disappeared into the forest. Only then did Duke relax. The dog returned to Ethan's side. The crisis had lasted less than 5 minutes. Neither of them slept afterward. By dawn, frost coated the sleeping bag. Ethan stared across the frozen valley while the first sunlight touched the mountains. His beard had grown longer. His face looked older. The reflection in a nearby creek barely resembled the man who once owned a ranch. But Duke still looked at him the same way, not with pity, not with disappointment, with trust. That afternoon, Ethan sat outside a small grocery store, counting what remained of his money. Not much. Certainly not enough. A newspaper abandoned on a bench beside him caught his eye. Most of the pages were damp from melted snow. He almost ignored it. Then a small advertisement near the bottom corner grabbed his attention. County Railroad Liquidation Auction. Abandoned rolling stock. Surplus equipment. Cash only. Saturday. He stared at the notice longer than necessary. Something about it lingered. Maybe because he had spent most of his civilian life working around railroads. Maybe because it reminded him of a world he once understood. Or maybe because fate sometimes arrives disguised as coincidence. Beside him, Duke suddenly lifted his head. The shepherd was staring toward the distant mountains. Alert, focused, the same expression he would wear days later while looking at the locked rail car. At the time, Ethan didn't know why. He only folded the newspaper and slipped it into his pocket. Neither of them realized it yet. But every road they had traveled since leaving the ranch had been leading toward that forgotten rail yard, toward a rusted military transport car, toward a secret buried beneath decades of silence, and toward the first real chance either of them had been given since losing everything. The morning after the auction, Ethan stood in front of the rail car again. The sky was clear. The mountains were sharp against the horizon. Fresh snow covered the abandoned yard. Everything looked untouched, frozen in place, except Duke. The shepherd had already walked back to the locked door again. The same place. The same focus. Ethan watched him carefully. Years ago, military trainers had taught handlers to trust their dogs. Not because dogs were magical, because they noticed things humans missed. Scents, sounds, patterns, changes. Duke had once found hidden explosives buried beneath roadside gravel in Afghanistan. He had detected strangers before they entered secured compounds. More than once, he had saved lives, including Ethan's. Now he was staring at an 8-0-year-old rail car as if it mattered. That alone made Ethan take it seriously. The problem was the lock. It was enormous. Old military steel, corroded but still solid. The railcar itself sat at the far edge of the property, disconnected from the main yard. Nobody seemed interested in it. Nobody. Except Ethan and Duke. A maintenance worker eventually wandered over carrying a coffee cup. The man looked to be in his 60s. Gray beard, heavy coat, railroad patch sewn onto one sleeve. "You bought the thing?" Ethan nodded. "Looks that way." The man chuckled. "I'm Noah Briggs." "Ethan." Noah glanced at Duke. The dog never took his eyes off the rail car. Smart shepherd. "He usually is." Noah studied the lock. "Got a cutter?" "No. Give me an hour." Before Ethan could answer, Noah walked away. The old rail worker returned 90 minutes later, carrying bolt cutters that looked almost as old as the rail car itself. He handed them over, without ceremony. "Try not to lose those." Ethan looked surprised. "Why help me?" Noah shrugged. "Because winter's coming." That was apparently enough explanation. The lock resisted. Then resisted some more. Rust cracked. Metal groaned. The cutter slipped twice. Finally, on the third attempt, the steel shackle snapped with a loud, metallic crack. The sound echoed across the yard. Duke immediately stood. Every muscle tightened. Ethan noticed. The shepherd wasn't excited. He was alert. Very alert. Noah grabbed the handle. "Ready?" Ethan nodded. Together they pulled. The old door refused to move. They pulled harder. A long, grinding noise filled the air. Dust fell from the rails. Rust broke free. Then the massive door slowly slid open. Darkness waited inside. Cold darkness. The smell came first. Old wood, dust, machine oil, a scent untouched by time. Sunlight pushed into the opening. The interior gradually revealed itself. Empty. At least it appeared empty. No crates, no treasure, no equipment. Just a long abandoned military transport car. Noah exhaled. Well, Ethan stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots. Dust coated every surface. Light streamed through tiny cracks in the walls. The space felt surprisingly dry, surprisingly intact, as if somebody had wanted it preserved. Duke entered behind him immediately, without hesitation. The shepherd began moving slowly through the railcar. Head low, nose working, every step deliberate. Ethan watched. Something about the dog's behavior felt different. Not searching, tracking. The distinction mattered. Noah eventually left. The rail car now belonged entirely to Ethan. His first piece of property since losing the ranch. His only piece of property. That afternoon, he carried his backpack inside. Then his sleeping bag. Then the few remaining belongings he still owned. By sunset, the abandoned rail car had become home. Not much of one, but home. The first night inside was warmer than sleeping outside. Not comfortable, just survivable. The steel walls blocked the wind. The roof stopped the snow. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt something close to relief. After dark, he sat against the wall, eating canned beans, warmed over a small camping stove. Duke lay near the center of the rail car, watching, listening. The lantern cast long shadows across the floor. Outside, the wind moved through distant pines. Inside, the old railcar creaked occasionally as temperatures dropped. Around midnight, Ethan woke. Not from a nightmare. From movement, Duke was standing again. The shepherd wasn't looking toward the door. He wasn't looking outside. He was staring at the floor. One specific section of the floor, near the rear corner, completely still. Ethan rubbed sleep from his eyes. Duke, the dog, didn't move. Duke, still nothing. Then Duke slowly walked toward the corner, sat down, and placed one paw directly on the floorboards, as if marking a location. Ethan stared. The boards looked exactly like every other board. Old, dusty, ordinary. Yet Duke remained there, watching, waiting. The lantern light flickered across the wood. For several long moments, neither of them moved. Then Ethan noticed something. A faint difference, not visible at first glance. But once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. One section of floor seemed slightly newer than the surrounding boards, only by a few years. Maybe a different repair, maybe nothing, or maybe something. Duke lowered his head, touched the floor with his nose, then looked directly at Ethan. The same look he had used years ago after finding hidden threats overseas. The same look that always meant one thing. You need to see this. Outside, snow began falling again. Inside, Ethan felt his pulse quicken. For the first time since opening the rail car, he no longer believed it was empty. And deep beneath the floorboards of the old military transport car, something had been waiting a very long time to be found. Ethan didn't sleep much that night, partly because of the cold. Mostly because of the floor. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured the slightly different boards in the rear corner, the ones Duke refused to ignore. Before sunrise, he gave up trying to sleep. The temperature inside the railcar had fallen below freezing. His breath hung in the air. Outside, snow covered the abandoned tracks in a smooth white blanket. Duke was already awake, watching the corner again. Always the corner. Ethan shook his head. "You're not giving up, are you?" The shepherd's ears twitched. That was answer enough. The next few days were spent surviving. Discovery could wait. End of Ines. Of Lee. End. End. Of. End. End. Of. End. End. Winter couldn't. The small amount of money Ethan had left disappeared quickly. Food, propane, a few basic supplies. Nothing lasted long in Montana during November. One morning, he walked 3 miles into town looking for work. Duke trotted beside him through fresh snow. The town itself looked tired. A handful of businesses remained open. Several storefronts and sat empty. Others seemed one bad season away from joining them. Near the edge of Main Street stood a small general store. The sign above the entrance read Turner's General Mercantile. Inside, warmth wrapped around him immediately. A bell chimed over the door. Shelves held everything from canned soup to fishing hooks. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She glanced at Ethan, then at Duke, then at the snow, clinging to both of them. "Cold morning feels that way." The woman smiled. "I'm Grace Turner." "Ethan." She nodded toward Duke. "Beautiful dog." Duke sat automatically. Disciplined. Calm. Grace noticed. "Military, both of us." Something in her expression softened. Without asking questions, she poured coffee into a paper cup and slid it across the counter. Ethan reached for his wallet. She waved him off. "First, cups. Free." The coffee felt almost painful in his frozen hands. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Grace glanced toward a bulletin board near the register. "You looking for work?" Ethan followed her gaze. Several handwritten notices hung there. Fence repairs, wood stacking, equipment maintenance, odd jobs. The kind of work nobody else wanted. The kind of work Ethan knew well. By noon, he had earned $40 repairing a broken gate outside town. The amount wasn't much, but it felt like oxygen. A way forward. Not charity. Work that mattered. 3 days later, he met Pastor Reed. The pastor arrived at the railroad, carrying a cardboard box filled with blankets. Apparently, Grace had told him about the veteran living inside the abandoned rail car. "You don't have to take these," Reed said. "But I'd sleep better knowing you did." Ethan accepted. Not because he liked help, because refusing warmth in Montana was foolish. The pastor returned the following week with canned food, then again with firewood, never making a big deal about it, never asking questions Ethan didn't want to answer. The kindness felt genuine, rare. By December, another familiar face began appearing around the railroad. Noah Briggs, the retired rail worker who had helped open the rail car. Sometimes he brought tools, sometimes advice. Mostly he brought conversation. One afternoon, Noah stepped inside and whistled. "You've practically built yourself a cabin." It wasn't entirely untrue. Ethan had repaired leaks, sealed cracks, built a simple sleeping platform from discarded pallets. The rail car no longer looked abandoned. It looked occupied, alive, home. That evening, Noah handed him a small cast-iron stove. The thing was ugly, heavy, covered in soot, but functional. "Found it behind my workshop." Ethan stared. "You sure? Positive?" The first fire transformed everything. Warmth spread slowly through the rail car. Not enough to make it comfortable, enough to make it survivable. For the first time since losing the ranch, Ethan slept nearly 4 straight hours. Nearly. At 2:30 inches the morning, a loud metallic pop from the cooling stove jerked him awake. His body reacted before his mind. He rolled from the bed platform, hit the floor, heart racing, scanning exits, searching threats. The rail car vanished. For one terrible second, he was back inside a damaged warehouse near Fallujah. Incoming contact. Darkness. Chaos. Then, he saw Duke. The shepherd hadn't moved. He simply watched, waiting for Ethan to return. Slowly, the flashback dissolved. The rail car returned. The stove, the snow, the silence. Ethan sat on the floor and laughed quietly at himself. Still got some miles on those old reflexes. Duke walked over and rested his head against Ethan's shoulder. The moment passed, but something else remained. The corner. Even now, even after weeks, Duke continued visiting the same section of floor every day. Sometimes he sat there. Sometimes he sniffed. Sometimes he simply stared. No barking, no scratching, just patient certainty. One afternoon, Ethan decided to test something. He dropped a wrench near the center of the rail car. The sound echoed normally. Then he dropped it near Duke's corner. The sound changed slightly. A little deeper, a little hollow. Ethan froze. Duke immediately looked up. Their eyes met. The shepherd stood, walked to the corner, and sat directly on the spot. Again, the exact same spot. Snow fell outside. The stove crackled softly. And for the first time, Ethan became certain of one thing. His dog wasn't imagining this. There was something beneath those boards. Something hidden. Something deliberate. And sooner or later, they were going to find out exactly what it was. The storm came in after dark. It swept down through the Bitterroot Valley with a low, steady growl, pushing snow sideways across the railard and rattling every loose sheet of metal within a half-mile. The old rail car groaned in the wind, its wooden walls flexing just enough to sound alive. Ethan had banked the stove low. A small orange light pulsed behind the iron door. Duke lay near the rear corner again, his head down, but his ears still working. Ethan sat on the pallet bed with his boots on. He rarely took them off at night. That was another habit that had survived too many years. Boots near the bed were fine for ordinary men. On the ground and laced was better for men who still woke, ready to move. Outside, something slammed against the side of the rail car. A branch maybe, or a loose piece of scrap, carried by the wind. The sound hit hard, metal on metal. Ethan's body reacted before thought arrived. He was on the floor in one motion, shoulder against the wall, eyes on the door, hand reaching for nothing at his side. The stove cracked softly. Snow hissed against the seams. Duke was already standing, but he wasn't looking at the door. He was looking down the rear corner again. Then came the sound, faint at first. A thin scrape under the floorboards. Ethan held still. The scrape came again. Not from outside, from beneath them. Duke lowered his nose to the seam between two boards and let out one short breath. Not a bark, a warning. Ethan took the lantern and crossed the rail car slowly, each step careful. Weight distributed, like moving through an uncleared room, he crouched beside the dog. "Show me." Duke pressed one paw to the boards, then began to dig. Not wildly, precisely, claws striking the same seam again and again. Wood dust lifted. Old dirt broke loose. Duke, easy. The shepherd didn't stop. His paw scraped faster, harder. A dark smear appeared on the floor. Blood. Ethan grabbed his collar gently. Enough. Duke resisted for half a second, then obeyed. He sat back, chest rising and falling, eyes locked on the spot. Ethan looked at the bloody paw. One nail had split near the edge. Not deep, but enough. "Damn it, dog," he said it softly. Not angry, not really. He wrapped the paw with a strip torn from an old undershirt. Duke allowed it, but his gaze never left the floor. Ethan reached for the pry bar. Noah had loaned him. The first board wouldn't move, neither would the second. He worked the flat edge into the seam and leaned his weight into it. The wood gave a low complaint. Then a nail popped free with a sharp crack. The sound snapped through the rail car. Ethan flinched just once, then kept going. One board lifted, then another. Beneath them was not empty space. There was steel. A flat metal panel hidden under the flooring, painted the same dull green as old army equipment. 4 bolts held it in place. The metal had no rust, none, as if the floor above had protected it from every winter since the war ended. Ethan brushed away dust with his sleeve. Letters appeared beneath the grime. U.S. Army Transportation Corps below that a faded number. The lantern flame trembled in the draft. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. Duke stood beside him on 3 good paws, quiet and steady. The wind outside roared through the pines. Inside, the past had just opened one eye. Ethan found a sock wrench in his tool roll. The first bolt resisted. The second turned with a groan. The third nearly stripped. By the time the last bolt came loose, sweat had dampened the back of his shirt despite the cold. He slid the pry bar beneath the panel. Pulled nothing. He pulled harder. The seal broke with a dry, tearing sound. Air rose from below, cold, still, old. Not rotten, not damp. Preserved. Ethan lifted the panel enough for lantern light to spill into the space beneath. A hidden compartment ran beneath the floor, not large enough for a man to stand in, but large enough to store something. Several somethings. Wooden military crates sat in 2 neat rows below, dark green, metal-banded, sealed. Each one marked with stenciled lettering. Property of U.S. Army Transportation Corps. Handle with care. Ethan stared down into the compartment. His mouth went dry. Noah had said the rail car was useless. The auctioneer had called it junk. Every man in that yard had walked away, but someone decades ago had hidden sealed military crates beneath the floor and covered them so carefully that generations missed them. Duke leaned forward, sniffed once, and gave a low sound, deep in his throat. Not fear, recognition. Ethan lowered the lantern closer. On the nearest crate, beneath the army marking, someone had written by hand in black paint, now faded, but still readable. Whitmore files do not destroy. The storm hammered the rail car. The floorboards lay scattered around them. Ethan sat back on his heels. The cold air from the compartment climbed around him like a ghost. Whatever had been hidden here was not scrap. It was not forgotten equipment. It was protected. And for the first time, since his children had pushed him out of his own home, Ethan Walker felt the weight of something trusting him back. He did not open the crates that night. That would have been careless. The storm still pushed against the rail car. Snow pressed through the smallest seams. The stove had burned low, and Duke's paw needed attention more than any secret did. Ethan lowered the steel panel back over the compartment, not bolting it shut, just hiding what was beneath. Then he placed the floorboards loosely over it and swept dust across the seams with his boot. Old habits returned without invitation. Cover the sign. Control the sight. Don't let the wrong eyes see what you found. He knelt beside Duke and unwrapped the torn strip of undershirt from the dog's paw. The split nail had stopped bleeding, but the pad was raw where he had scraped the floor again and again. "You're too stubborn for your own good," Ethan murmured. Duke watched him with steady amber eyes. Ethan cleaned the paw with warm water from the kettle. Duke did not pull away. He only exhaled once through his nose and rested his muzzle on Ethan's knee. Outside, the storm swallowed the yard. By morning, the rail car was buried in white. The mountains had disappeared. Ethan stepped out before sunrise, moving slowly through knee-deep snow. He made one full circle around the rail car. Not because he expected trouble, but because expectation was never the point. Check the perimeter. Read the ground. Know what changed. Near the rear wheels, he stopped. There were tracks in the snow. Not his. Not Duke's boot prints. Large, fresh enough that the edges had not yet softened. They circled once along the north side of the rail car, stopped near the open section of track, then doubled back toward the access road. Ethan crouched. The print was deep at the heel, light at the toe. Someone had stood there for a while, watching. Duke limped up behind him and lowered his nose to the track. A low sound rolled in the dog's chest. Ethan looked toward the road. Nothing moved, only white fields, dark pine, and a pale morning sky. He did not tell Grace Turner about the crates when he went into town that afternoon. He did not tell Pastor Reed when the pastor dropped off canned soup and firewood. He did not even tell Noah Briggs at first, not because he distrusted them, because once a thing became words, it started traveling, and whatever was under that floor had waited too long to be handed carelessly to rumor. But rumor found them anyway. 2 days later, a black pickup slowed near the railed gate. Ethan was splitting kindling beside the rail car when he heard the engine drop low. He did not look up immediately. Looking too fast told a watcher they had been seen. Instead, he kept working. One piece of wood, then another. Only when the truck rolled past did he glance toward it. Tinted windows, out-of-county plates, clean tires, despite the muddy access road. Not local. Duke had seen it too. The shepherd stood beside the wood pile, with his injured paw slightly lifted, ears forward, body quiet. The truck disappeared around the bend. That night, Ethan found another footprint near the door. This one close. Too close. A cigarette butt lay half buried in snow beside the rail. Ethan picked it up with a rag and placed it in an old coffee tin. He did not smoke. Noah came by the next morning carrying a coil of wire and a dented toolbox. He had the look of a man pretending he had not noticed tension. "You got visitors?" Ethan slid the coffee tin across the workbench. Noah looked inside. His face changed. "Victor Kane smokes those." Ethan waited. Noah scratched his beard. "Runs a private salvage outfit out near Missoula. Buys old military pieces, rail parts, antique equipment. Some of it legal, some of it gray enough you don't ask questions." "What does he want?" Noah looked at the rail car. "I'd say whatever he thinks you found." The words settled between them. That evening, Ethan did what he had not done since leaving the service. He prepared the area. Not with weapons, not with traps. Nothing dramatic. Just discipline. He hung tin cups near the door where they would fall if someone entered. He tied fishing line across the gravel approach at ankle height, not to hurt anyone, only to rattle a chain against an old coupler. He moved his bedroll away from the window line. He marked 3 routes out in his head. Primary, secondary, last resort. Duke watched every movement. The dog understood preparation. Around 17 inches the morning, the chain rattled. Ethan's eyes opened. No dream this time. No confusion. Contact. He lay still in the dark, one hand resting on Duke's shoulder. The shepherd was already awake. No bark. No movement. Just waiting. A shadow crossed the narrow gap beneath the railcar door. Then came the soft scrape of metal. Someone was working the latch. The tin cups fell. The sound exploded in the small space. Duke launched forward. A man, cursed, outside. Ethan grabbed the lantern and shoved the door open. Cold air blasted in. A figure stumbled back from the rail car, face hidden by a hood. Duke hit the snow first, driving the intruder away from the door. "Duke, hold!" But the man swung something in panic. Not a knife, not a weapon meant for killing. A jagged strip of torn metal grabbed from the scrap pile. It caught Duke along the front leg. The dog yelped once. Only once. Then he still placed himself between the man and Ethan. The intruder ran. Ethan saw the face, for half a second, under the hood. Victor Kame. Then the black pickup roared to life beyond the gate and vanished into the dark road. Ethan dropped to his knees in the snow. Duke was standing, but blood marked the white beneath his paw. "No, no, no," Ethan whispered. The shepherd leaned against him, still watching the road, still guarding, even hurt, even bleeding. Ethan pressed both hands around the wound and pulled the dog close against his chest. The night around them was silent again. But something had changed. Whatever was hidden under that floor was valuable enough for someone to come in the dark, and Duke had just paid the first price for protecting it. The nearest veterinarian was 20 meters away. Ethan drove there before sunrise in Noah Briggs's pickup. The old rail worker never asked whether he could borrow it. He simply tossed Ethan the keys and said, "Go." The heater rattled weakly as they traveled through the snowy valley. Duke lay across the passenger seat, quiet, too quiet. Every few minutes, Ethan glanced over. The shepherd's eyes remained open, watching him, making sure he was still there. The wound turned out to be deep but clean. No broken bone, no permanent damage. At least that was what the veterinarian said. Ethan listened carefully, then listened again. Veterans became good at hearing bad news before it arrived. This time the news wasn't bad. Not entirely. Dogs his age don't heal as fast, the veterinarian explained. But he's tough. Ethan looked down at Duke. Yeah, that part wasn't news. 3 days later, they were back in the rail car. Snow covered the mountains. The storm had passed, but something else had arrived. A new awareness. Someone wanted what was hidden below. That meant Ethan needed answers. He waited until Duke was sleeping beside the stove before removing the floorboards again. The hidden compartment looked exactly as he remembered. Dustless, protected, preserved. The nearest crate sat directly beneath the lantern light. Whitmore files do not destroy. Ethan ran his hand across the faded letters. Whoever wrote them had expected danger, expected loss, expected someone to try erasing whatever had been placed inside. The crate took nearly 20 minutes to open. The nails resisted. The wood was old but stubborn. Finally, the lid lifted. Ethan stared. Not gold, not money, not military equipment, paper, hundreds of pages. Carefully wrapped bundles, leather journals, maps, folders, tied with cloth ribbons. For several seconds, he simply sat there. The disappointment lasted less than a heartbeat. And curiosity replaced it. He picked up the nearest journal. The cover was cracked from age. Inside, neat handwriting filled every page. Military notes, measurements, supply routes, engineering calculations, names, dates, observations. The writing belonged to someone named Sarah Whitmore. Captain Sarah Whitmore, Transportation Corps. Ethan opened another journal, then another. The same name appeared again and again. By midnight, the stove had burned low. The rail car was silent, except for the occasional turn of a page. The deeper Ethan read, the stranger the story became. Sarah Whitmore wasn't simply documenting routine military work. She was solving problems. Major problems. Entire sections described supply routes through dangerous terrain, improvised rail systems, transport efficiencies, methods that reduced delivery times dramatically. The writing wasn't theoretical. It worked. Every entry included results, field tests, outcomes, recommendations. The work was brilliant and somehow completely unfamiliar. Ethan had spent years around military logistics. He recognized expertise when he saw it. This wasn't ordinary paperwork. This was the record of someone whose ideas mattered. Someone who should have been remembered. Yet Ethan had never heard her name. That bothered him. The next afternoon, he carried several journals into town. Grace Turner was restocking shelves when he arrived. The bell above the door chimed. Duke limped beside him. The slight stiffness in his front leg immediately caught Grace's attention. What happened? Protected something. Grace knelt and scratched behind Duke's ears. Sounds like him. Ethan smiled faintly. Then he showed her the journals. Within minutes, she stopped stocking shelves entirely. She adjusted her reading glasses, turned pages, read sections twice. These look important. I think so too. Grace knew someone. Everyone in small towns knew someone. By evening, she had connected Ethan with a retired history teacher named Harold Jensen. Harold arrived at the rail car the following morning, carrying 3 notebooks and enough enthusiasm for 2 people. He spent 4 hours reading, 4 hours muttering to himself, 4 hours forgetting to drink the coffee Ethan made. Finally, he lowered the last journal. His face had changed. Do you know what you've got here? No. Harold laughed softly. Neither do I. That answer surprised Ethan. Harold tapped one of the notebooks. But I know enough to tell you this isn't ordinary. He pointed to Sarah Whitmore's name. I've studied Montana military history for 20 years. Another page turned. I've studied railroad logistics. Another page. I've studied wartime transportation. Then he looked directly at Ethan. And I've never once heard of this woman. Silence settled inside the rail car. Outside, snow slid from the roof with a soft thud. Harold continued. That's what makes this strange. He tapped the engineering diagrams. People capable of work like this don't disappear. Ethan thought about that. People capable of work like this don't disappear. Yet somehow, Sarah Whitmore had just like the rail car, just like the journals, just like everything hidden beneath the floor. That night, Ethan sat alone, reading beside the stove. Duke slept nearby. His injured leg twitched occasionally in dreams. One journal entry caught Ethan's attention. The 14th of January, 1945. The words were written harder than the others, as if the writer had been angry. They reviewed the transport proposal today. Colonel R. presented my work as his own. No objections were raised. Ethan read the sentence twice, then a third time. The next page contained another entry. The names changed, the details changed, the pattern didn't. Recommendations credited elsewhere. Reports signed by others. Recognition disappearing. One piece at a time. The realization settled slowly. Sarah Whitmore hadn't been forgotten by accident. Someone had benefited from her disappearance. Someone had taken credit. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees. Inside, the lantern cast long shadows across the railcar walls. Ethan closed the journal. Across the room, Duke lifted his head. The old shepherd looked at him, then toward the hidden compartment, as if reminding him there was still more down there, much more, and somewhere inside those remaining crates waited the answer to why someone had hidden Sarah Whitmore's work, and why someone else still wanted it gone. The answer began arriving, one visitor at a time. 3 weeks after Harold Jensen made his first trip to the rail car, A university historian stepped through the door carrying 2 cameras, a laptop case, and the kind of cautious excitement that people try very hard to hide. Her name was Dr. Melissa Grant. She specialized in military transportation history. By the end of her first hour inside the rail car, she had stopped trying to hide anything. "You found all of this here?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Duke found it first." The historian looked down at the German shepherd. The old dog laid beside the stove, with his injured legs stretched carefully in front of him. The wound had healed mostly, but the limp remained. Every time he stood, Ethan noticed it. Every time he noticed it, he remembered the blood in the snow. Dr. Grant spent the entire day reviewing journals, maps, engineering drawings, field reports. The deeper she dug, the quieter she became. By sunset, she was no longer taking notes. She was staring. At one point, she removed her glasses and rubbed both eyes. "This shouldn't exist." Ethan looked up. "What does that mean?" She opened a folder. Inside were copies of official wartime transportation reports. Then she placed one of Sarah Whitmore's journals beside them. The similarities were obvious. The diagrams matched. The route designs matched. Entire logistical solutions matched. Only one thing was different. The name. Official reports. Credited senior officers. Sarah Whitmore's journals showed who had actually created the work. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Wind rattled the railcar walls. The stove crackled softly. Dr. Grant finally broke the silence. "I think someone built their career using her ideas." Ethan leaned back. The statement didn't surprise him anymore. Somewhere along the way, it had become exactly what he expected. People disappeared. Credit disappeared. Truth disappeared. History often followed whoever controlled the paperwork. Sarah Whitmore apparently hadn't controlled much of anything except the evidence. And somehow she had hidden that evidence beneath a train car floor. The following month became a blur. Researchers arrived. Then more researchers, photographers, archivists, military historians. Each person spent hours inside the rail car, and each one left looking slightly stunned. The story grew larger with every document. Sarah Whitmore had designed supply routes that reduced transportation delays during the final year of World War II. Several of her innovations appeared decades ahead of their time. One engineering report described rail loading systems that would not become standard practice until years later. Another outlined emergency logistic procedures that military planners still studied today. The more experts learned, the stranger the mystery became. Why had nobody heard of her? Why had nobody preserved her work? And why had she gone through such extraordinary lengths to hide everything? One snowy afternoon, Dr. Grant arrived, carrying a folder thicker than usual. She spread documents across Ethan's table. Duke may have uncovered one of the most important military archive discoveries in decades. Ethan glanced toward the dog. The shepherd slept beside the stove, dreaming. His paws twitched occasionally, running somewhere only he could see. Dr. Grant pointed to several names. Colonels, administrators, procurement officers. Many had received promotions shortly after Sarah Whitmore disappeared from official records. Several reports previously credited to those men now appeared suspicious. The evidence wasn't absolute, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. "Someone benefited," Ethan said. Dr. Grant nodded. "Several people probably did." Outside, snow drifted across the abandoned tracks. The mountains glowed pale blue beneath the winter sky. For a moment, Ethan thought about Iraq, about young soldiers whose names never appeared in newspapers, people who carried burdens while others collected recognition. The feeling was familiar. Too familiar. That evening, He opened one of Sarah's journals again. Near the back, he found an entry dated March 1945. The handwriting seemed different, more tired, more urgent. I no longer believe the work will be credited correctly. Therefore, I have begun preserving copies elsewhere. Ethan read the sentence twice, then a third time. Preserving copies elsewhere. She knew. She had known exactly what was happening. Another page followed. If these records survive, then the truth survives. That line stayed with him long after he closed the journal. The truth survives. Simple, direct, uncompromising. The words felt like something a soldier would understand. Across the room, Duke slowly stood. The limp was noticeable now. Subtle, permanent. He crossed the rail car and settled beside Ethan's chair. Without thinking, Ethan rested a hand on the shepherd's head. The dog closed his eyes, comfortable, safe. Months earlier, they had both been sleeping outside. Now, historians traveled across the country to visit a rail car everyone once ignored. The change felt impossible. Yet, here they were. Still, one question remained, the biggest one. What finally happened to Sarah Whitmore? The answer wasn't in the reports or the maps or the engineering journals, at least not yet. But somewhere among the remaining crates, Ethan was certain there was one final piece of the story. One final reason she had hidden everything, and one final truth she had been trying to protect for nearly 80 years. Spring arrived slowly in the Bitterroot Valley. Snow retreated from the lower slopes first, then from the roads, then from the abandoned railroad where Ethan Walker had somehow built a life from $10 and a forgotten train car. The mountains were still capped in white, but the air had changed. The world was waking up again. By then, the story had escaped Montana. Newspapers ran features. Military history journals published preliminary findings. A regional television crew spent an afternoon filming inside the rail car. Dr. Melissa Grant's team continued cataloging Sarah Whitmore's archives. Every week brought another confirmation, another piece of evidence, another reason to believe Sarah Whitmore had helped reshape wartime logistics while receiving almost none of the credit. And every article mentioned the same thing, discovered by retired veteran Ethan Walker and his German shepherd Duke. The attention made Ethan uncomfortable. Duke handled it better. Children visiting the rail car loved him. Veterans visiting the site gravitated toward him. The shepherd accepted scratches behind the ears with the calm patience of an old soldier. His limp remained. Small, permanent, visible. A reminder. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan was repairing a section of fencing near the rail car when he heard tires crunching on gravel. He looked up. A silver SUV rolled slowly into the yard. For a second, he thought it might be another reporter. Then he saw who stepped out. Michael Clare, his son and daughter. Neither moved immediately. The wind carried across the valley. Birds called from the pines. The distance between them felt larger than the entire railroad. Duke noticed them too. The shepherd stood beside Ethan, silent, watching. Michael approached first, older than Ethan remembered, more tired. Claire followed several steps behind. Neither looked comfortable. Neither looked prepared. "Hi, Dad." Ethan nodded once. Michael, Claire. His daughter swallowed. "Hi." Silence followed. Not hostile. Not angry. Heavy. Months earlier, Ethan would have filled that silence. Not anymore. Eventually, Michael glanced toward the rail car, then toward the visitors, walking through the historical displays, then back to Ethan. "We've been following everything." Ethan said nothing. "We saw the interviews. Still nothing." Claire finally spoke. "We should have come sooner." The honesty surprised him. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. The three of them stood quietly while the wind moved through the valley. Then Michael looked at Duke. The shepherd's scarred face, the slight limp, the gray fur, beginning to appear around his muzzle. What happened to his leg? Ethan followed his gaze. For a moment, he considered giving a simple answer. Instead, he told the truth. He protected the rail car. Michael frowned. What do you mean? So Ethan told them. Not everything. Just enough. The winter. The cold. Sleeping in the rail car. The night someone tried breaking in. The blood in the snow. Duke, standing his ground. Anyway, neither Michael nor Claire interrupted. The story didn't need help. When Ethan finished, nobody spoke. Duke lay down beside his chair. His injured paw stretched forward. Visible. Real. The cost of loyalty, resting in plain sight. Michael stared at the dog, then lowered his eyes. Claire looked away toward the mountains. A long silence followed. Finally, Michael spoke. We were wrong. Ethan looked at him. His son continued. We thought we were helping. No. The word came gently. Not harsh. Not bitter. Simply true, Michael nodded. I know. Another silence. Then Claire wiped at her eyes. We should have been there. Ethan watched both of them. For the first time since they arrived, they looked less like visitors and more like the children he remembered. Not because they were perfect, because they finally seemed honest. Michael took a breath. We'd like to help now. The words hung between them. Ethan glanced toward Duke. The shepherd lifted his head, watching, waiting the same way he always did. Then Ethan looked back at his children. He thought about the nights in the snow, the church meals, the bus shelters, the rail car, the cold mornings, the loneliness. Most of all, he thought about who stayed. Not who left, who stayed. His gaze settled on Duke, then returned to Michael and Claire. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm. The dog stayed. Neither child moved. You didn't. The words landed softly, but harder than shouting ever could. No anger, no accusation, just fact. A truth impossible to argue with. Claire looked down. Michael's shoulders sagged. Neither defended themselves. Neither tried because there wasn't a defense. Only silence. A long one. Eventually, Ethan stood. The old shepherd rose beside him. Together, they looked toward the railcar, toward the place that had saved them both. If we're going to rebuild anything, Ethan said quietly, it won't happen because of newspaper articles. Michael nodded. Claire nodded too. It'll happen because we tell the truth. The wind moved through the valley. Visitors wandered among the displays. Far above them, snow still clung to the highest peaks. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Michael stepped forward. Not for a handshake, not for forgiveness, just to stand beside his father. And for the first time in a very long while, Ethan didn't step away because trust wasn't returning. Not yet. But maybe something else was a beginning. Slow, fragile, honest, the only kind worth having. A year later, the rail car no longer stood alone. What had once been an abandoned relic at the edge of a forgotten yard had become something else entirely. People traveled from across Montana to see it. Veterans came, students came, historians came, families came. Some arrived because they had heard about Sarah Whitmore. Others came because they had heard about Ethan Walker and the German Shepherd, who found what history had forgotten. Most left talking about both. The old railroad had changed. A gravel parking area sat near the entrance. New signs marked the path toward the railcar. Inside, carefully protected displays told the story of Captain Sarah Whitmore's work. The journals, the maps, the engineering plans, the evidence, the truth. For the first time in nearly 80 years, her name appeared where it belonged, not in a forgotten crate, not hidden beneath a floor, in the historical record. Lie, end, chait, end, end, not, end, not in a forgotten crate. Exactly where she had always deserved to be. Ethan never got used to seeing it. Every morning, he unlocked the visitor center that had been built beside the rail car. Every morning, he walked through the exhibits before anyone arrived. Not as a tour guide, not as a celebrity, as a caretaker, a responsibility he accepted with quiet pride. The rail car had saved him. The least he could do was protect its story. Duke still accompanied him everywhere. Age had slowed the shepherd. His muzzle was nearly white now. The limp remained. Some days it was more noticeable than others. Children often asked about it. Ethan always answered honestly. He earned it. That answer was usually enough. One afternoon in early autumn, Dr. Melissa Grant arrived, carrying a small archival box. Her expression immediately caught Ethan's attention. Not excitement, something deeper, something closer to reverence. "You found something?" She nodded. "We did." The two of them sat inside the rail car while visitors moved quietly outside. Sunlight filtered through the old wooden walls. Dust drifted through narrow beams of light. Duke slept beneath a display case. Melissa carefully opened the box. Inside rested a single envelope, yellowed, fragile, untouched. Ethan stared. Where was it? Hidden inside the false back of one of the remaining crates. She handed him a pair of archival gloves. Then she carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. Sarah Whitmore. Ethan read slowly. The words seemed to bridge decades. To whoever finds this, if these records survived, then perhaps the truth survived as well. I have spent years watching good work disappear beneath other names, watching recognition travel upward while responsibility travels down. I cannot control what happens to me, but I can preserve what happened. Someone will find this one day. Perhaps a historian, perhaps a soldier, perhaps another forgotten person. If that person is reading these words now, know this. Being overlooked is not the same as being without value. Truth waits. Sometimes for years, sometimes for generations, but truth waits. Thank you for finding me. The letter ended there. No signature. None was needed. Silence filled the rail car. Outside, distant voices drifted across the valley. Inside, Ethan sat motionless. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. Not from weakness, from recognition. A soldier. A forgotten person. The words felt uncomfortably precise, as if Sarah Whitmore had somehow reached across 80 years and spoken directly to him. Eventually, he folded the letter carefully, respectfully, then placed it back inside the archival sleeve. Neither he nor Melissa spoke for several moments. There wasn't much left to say. Some discoveries explained themselves. That evening, the visitors gradually departed. The parking lot emptied. The valley grew quiet. Shadows stretched across the mountains. Golden light settled over the bitter roots. Ethan carried a folding chair outside and placed it beside the rail car. The same rail car that had once been worth $10, the same rail car everyone else ignored. Duke slowly lowered himself onto the grass beside him. The old shepherd let out a contented sigh. For a while, they simply watched the sunset. No television, no traffic, no reporters, just the wind moving through pine trees. Far away, a freight train sounded its horn. The note drifted across the valley. Long, low, familiar. Years earlier, that sound might have dragged Ethan into a memory, a flashback, a sleepless night, a place he didn't want to revisit. Tonight, it didn't. The sound came, then passed, like weather, like time, like everything else. Ethan leaned back in the chair. The last sunlight touched the mountains. Beside him, Duke rested his head across his paws, watching, guarding, the way he always had, the way he always would. For the first time in many years, Ethan closed his eyes. Not because exhaustion forced him to, because he wanted to. No sudden wake up, no racing heartbeat, no search for exits, no ghosts, just quiet, the kind of quiet he thought he'd lost forever. The evening air cooled around them. The valley darkened. Stars appeared one by one above the mountains. And there, beside a rail car filled with recovered history, sat a veteran the world had nearly discarded, and a dog who never once left his side. The rail car had preserved Sarah Whitmore's legacy. Duke had preserved Ethan's. And together, they had proven something. Neither history nor hardship could erase. A person's value does not disappear simply because others failed to see it. The wind moved softly through the pines. Night settled over the bitter roots, and at long last both old soldiers were home. Night settled over the bitter roots. If you believe loyalty matters more than money, type a simple one in the comments. And if Duke's devotion touched your heart, leave a so we can see how many people he inspired today. Stories like Ethan and Duke's remind us that sometimes the ones the world overlooks are the ones who leave the greatest mark behind. If this story meant something to you, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. There are many more powerful stories waiting ahead. Stories of courage, second chances, unexpected discoveries, and loyal companions who refuse to give up. Your next unforgettable story is already waiting.